Iris Murdoch, when you're writing a novel on the one hand and philosophy on the other, are you actually conscious that you're engaged in two radically different kinds of writing? Are you conscious that you're writing differently?
Oh, very much so, yes. These two branches of thought have such different aims and such different styles, and I feel very strongly that one should keep them apart from each other. I mean, that is that when one's writing philosophy, one's writing something which is very much more like science in a way than it's like literature. And literature, of course, has its own rules and its own tricks, and philosophy aims to clarify. In fact, it's essential to philosophy that should be, in some sense, clarification, and literature is very often mystification, and besides, literature is for fun, literature entertains, literature does many, many things, and philosophy does one thing.
Seems to me, having read many of your books, including your philosophical books, that the actual sentences themselves are different. I mean, what strikes me if I read one of your novels, the sentences are, so to speak, opaque in the sense that there's a lot in them. There's a heavy cargo. There's lots of connotation and allusion and ambiguity and so on. Whereas in your philosophical writing, the sentences are translucent. They're only saying one thing at a time.
Yes, well, I hope this is so, yes. I mean, if obviously one has a style as a writer, and I certainly have a probably recognizable style as a novelist, but my philosophical style would be something totally different, and I would be very pleased if it was impossible to tell it was the same person writing.
You said something a moment ago that interested me very much. You said that philosophy, I think I remembered your words correctly, you said philosophy, the aim of philosophy is to clarify, and the aim of literature is to mystify. And I suppose it's central to what the novelist or the playwright is doing, that he's actually trying to create an illusion, whereas it's central to what the philosopher is doing, that he's trying to dispel illusion or pierce through illusion or liberate his and our minds from illusion. Is that an essential part of the difference?
Yes, certainly. And philosophy is to do with getting hold of a problem and holding on to it relentlessly and doggedly. And this is the mark of a philosophical mind, this particular relentlessness, the fact that you stick to your problem.
Yeah. With the making of the contrast in mind, let's deal with these one at a time. I mean, how would you characterize literature as distinct from philosophy in this context?
Well, I don't think one can offer exactly a definition of literature, nor is it necessary in place here.
Shall we say some of the characteristics?
We know what literature is. It's an art form using words, and I would say that literature is art by definition, and the point at which, I mean, one could define it by contrasting it with, say, journalism or something. I dare say great journalism is literature, but there are all sorts of borderlines here. And literature is very, very various. And one thing that strikes one, of course, is that philosophy is very tiny. If you think how small European philosophy is,
but just the small body of work.
Yes, I mean, it's not a vast and multifarious area. What strikes one very much, I think, is the way in which the problems which were stated at the beginning are still there, which some people might regard as proof that one is not making much progress.
Well, the philosopher Whitehead once characterized this rather strikingly, didn't he, by saying that all Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato.
Yes.
And there's a sense in which that is true. I mean, Plato mapped out the territory, and we've all been working in it ever since.
I think the more one studies Plato, the more one sees that this is true, that he raised practically every problem and raised it in a very sophisticated way. Well, literature is vast and multifarious and multiform. It's not, of course, entirely to do with fictions. I mean, there are kinds of literature which aren't fiction, but
historical writing and essays,
reflections of all kinds. Yeah. But typical literature, as it were, I mean, stories and poems and so on, is fictional. It is to do partly with playing roles. That this is true to some extent of poetry, and I suppose entirely. Almost entirely, perhaps one should say, true of the novel, that it's to do with masks and roles and pretending and imagining in that sense, and storytelling. And in this sense, I think literature is very, natural. It's very close to ordinary life, and it's.
Well, we all tell stories.
We all tell stories. Yes,
in the
I
course
think
of our ordinary lives.
this is the most natural thing in the world.
Yes.
Telling stories. I mean, one is doing it all the time, possibly without noticing it. If one describes one's day, as it were, one is shaping one's material into a story form. Very often, it's a funny story, incidentally, which I think is a very important fact.
Yes, there aren't many jokes in philosophy.
No, there are witticisms,
Yes.
but not exactly
Yes.
jokes. Yeah, I think jokes would be out of place.
Yes,
And that somehow we live in a literary atmosphere. I mean, we live and breathe literature to some extent, in that when we tell stories or when we write letters and so on, we are making a form out of something which might be formless. And this is one of course, the deep motives for literature or for art of any sort, that one is defeating the formlessness of the world.
One is imposing order on one's
Yes, one is
experience
cheering
or
oneself
one's
up
environment.
and consoling oneself, and also, of course, instructing oneself by giving a form to something which is perhaps alarmingly formless in its original condition, a sort of rubble, as if we lived in a kind of rubble world, and one's always making forms.
Yes. When you say one's cheering oneself up, I mean, that brings to the fore the fact that one of the essential aims of literature has always been to entertain,
Yes,
hasn't it?
yes.
And I don't think that has anything whatever to do with the motive of philosophy.
No. I think it may be that philosophy also cheers us up, of course, because philosophy is the imposition of form on the formless in a vast way. But I think this is something which, insofar as the philosopher might be aware of this, it's something that he would be suspicious of in himself, because one's temptation to produce a hasty form or an inappropriate form in order to console oneself. This temptation is one that the philosopher, of course, has to avoid. And I think the good philosopher is always undoing his own work. This is part of the holding on to the problem, being dogged and relentless, which would also, of course, militate against certain kinds of literary devices, because it means that one has to repeat oneself, that philosophy is repetitive, it's coming back over the same ground and breaking the form that you've made. And
You've made a number of points here, especially in your characterization of literature, which by implication contrast with philosophy, but I'd like now to, as it were, draw out the contrasts explicitly. For example, you said just now that, and I think it's a striking fact about storytelling, you said that it's natural and that we all do it and it's part of everyday life, and certainly we all like being told stories. Whereas I suppose by contrast, philosophy is, as it were, counter-natural. I mean, philosophy involves essentially the critical analysis of one's beliefs and the presuppositions of one's beliefs. And it's very striking that people actually don't like having that done to them. None of us do. We don't like being analysed, and we don't like the assumptions on which our beliefs rest being questioned, because it makes us feel insecure and uncomfortable, and we all have a strong resistance to doing it.
Yes, I think it is a very counter-natural, a very unnatural activity. And when one starts doing philosophy, I mean, I notice this, of course, in teaching philosophy, that people are very reluctant to play this game or cannot see how it's done at all to begin with, because it involves a very odd sort of standpoint. It's notoriously difficult to define philosophy, of course. If somebody doesn't know what this activity is, it's very difficult to say what it is. It's to do with conceptual structures, to do with very deep structures of belief and knowledge. It's to do with meaning, significance. It's partly, of course, to do with words, in the sense that it's about how language relates to the world and that sort of thing. And it's not science, and it's not art, and it's very important that it's not science, I think, don't you think? I mean, that as soon as you start doing science, you're falling right out of philosophy. It's a kind of point of view which, although the style may be scientific, the actual, what you're doing is certainly not science. It's a kind of a reflection on concepts.
Yes, well, Bertrand Russell once said that it's the questions that we don't know how to answer, and I think Isaiah Berlin and other well-known contemporary philosophers also take this view.
And it means looking at things which one takes for granted and suddenly seeing that they're very, very odd indeed.
Yes. But the one thing that philosophy does have in common with science, I think, is that it's based on an attempt to understand the world and to understand our environment and to understand our situation in a way that doesn't consist just of expressing personal attitudes and personal views. There is an attempt to, as it were, submit oneself, and this was implicit in something you said just now, I think, to submit oneself to criteria outside oneself. In other words, you're trying to say something that is impersonally true.
Yes, yes.
And you said just now, I think when you were talking about the way you yourself write, you said that, and it's absolutely true, that your novel writing has a very distinctive literary personality, whereas I think you said you wouldn't mind if your philosophical writing was thought not to have any personality. Now, it strikes me that almost the most important thing about an imaginative or creative writer is this possession of a literary personality. If he hasn't got a distinctive personality in that sense, we're not interested in reading it. Whereas with philosophers, it just isn't the case. I mean, you could read all the works of Kant with great care and interest, and at the end of it have no idea what Kant was like as a human being.
Yes, of course, literature is various in this respect, isn't it? That some people have a distinctive style, other people don't. I suppose it is self-expression in a way by definition. I mean, that unless you wanted to express yourself, if you didn't have this motive, you'd lack a very important motive towards this form of art. Whereas philosophy is certainly not self-expression. And philosophy, of course, is argument. You can say, well, is the conclusion true or is the argument valid?
I found, when talking to friends of mine who may be, very intelligent and very well educated but don't know much about philosophy, I find they often express the assumption that philosophy is a branch of literature, that a philosopher is somehow expressing a personal view of the world in the way that a poet might be or a novelist might be. And it's not always easy to explain briefly why this is not so. I suppose it's partly because these problems, philosophical problems, have histories. And each individual philosopher comes on the scene at some stage in that developing history. And if he makes a contribution at all, it's rather like the scientist. He makes it at that stage. Otherwise, there isn't one to be made, so to speak.
Yes, philosophy. Philosophy is the history of philosophy in the sense that there is a development in the problems, and philosophy lives on philosophy. Very much more than art lives on art.
Yes. And I think the writing of art, the writing of novels and poems, engages very much more of the personality, both of the writer and the reader, actually, than philosophy does. Philosophy is a much more narrowly intellectual activity. In fact, I'd go farther. I'd say that literature, to be literature at all, must move one emotionally, whereas the philosopher, like the scientist, is actually trying to exclude emotional appeal, isn't he, from his work?
Yes, literature could be said to be a sort of disciplined technique for arousing certain emotions. That's certainly one of the reasons why one enjoys it, and one of the reasons perhaps why it's both good for us when it's good and bad for us when it's bad.